Welcome back, thank you. Our next speaker is Roseanne Schot. Roseanne is an archaeologist. She did her PhD thesis on the Hill of Uisneach, looking at the archaeology, history, mythology and landscape of the hill. Roseanne has worked as a research archaeologist and done fieldwork in the years since, including work on the other ancient royal sites, the Hill of Tara, Rathcroghan and Uisneadh. So I'm sure there's much more to Roseanne's biography and she might like to say a few words herself. And then Roseanne will talk about the work of MacAlister and Praeger here on the hill and some of her own work on the hill and analysis of their previous work. So, Roseanne.
Okay, thanks very much, Melanie, and thank you for organising the event. Hello to everybody here as well. So I'm really glad to have an opportunity on the centenary of MacAlister and Praeger's excavations at Uisneach. It's a timely opportunity to reflect on both the early archaeological investigations at this remarkable site and some of the more recent work and discoveries that have come to light since. Through their work a century ago, MacAlister and Praeger laid a foundation for all future research on Uisneach. My own work on the site began in 2001 when I started a PhD at NUI Galway on the archaeology and history of Uisneach and its wider cultural landscape. This truly was a case of being at the right place at the right time, because by the late 1990s, the Department of Archaeology at Galway had become a leading centre for research on Ireland's royal sites and their landscapes. And I was very fortunate to learn from the extensive expertise within that department. Several significant projects were underway at the time, with work on Tara, Rathcroghan and other royal sites led by Conor Newman, Professor John Waddell and Joe Fenwick, as well as Professor Elizabeth Fitzpatrick's extensive work on Gaelic inauguration and assembly places. At the same time, ongoing investigations and scholarship were taking place at Navan Fort and Uisneadh, following the first excavations at these sites in the 1960s and 70s. So these so-called provincial royal centres, Tara, Rathcroghan, Uisneadh and Navan Fort, were very much at the forefront of scholarly attention alongside several others. In contrast, Uisneach had been largely overlooked in archaeological research for the best part of 70 years when I began to study the site. One of the first major tasks was to undertake a comprehensive reappraisal of MacAlister and Praeger's excavations to effectively present a modern reinterpretation based on the most up-to-date archaeological evidence. By the time of these first documented archaeological excavations, Uisneach's reputation was already well established. The hill has long held both historical and mythological significance, most notably as the sacred umbilical centre of Ireland and meeting point of the ancient provinces, and as a major royal site. Historical sources indicate that the kingship of Uisneach was monopolised by a group of midland dynasties known collectively as the Southern Uisneadh, who claimed descent from a common ancestor, Niall of the Nine Hostages. Of these, Fiachú MacNeill and his descendants, Cenel Fiacha, were associated with Uisneach during the 6th and 7th centuries. However, it is their kinsmen, the rival dynasty of Clan Colman, that later came to dominate the kingship. Members of both dynasties are included in a list of kings of the kings of Midda, bearing the title Rí Uisneach, or Kings of Uisneach, which is preserved in the 12th century Book of Leinster. Alongside kings and nobles, druids and deities feature prominently in the mythology of Uisneach, among them Lu, the master of all arts and a god of kingship, the sovereignty goddess Eru, and the Dogna, father god of all, who is said to have had a house on Uisneach from which he could see equally far in every direction. Uisneach was also famed as the site of great gatherings and assemblies, many of which provided the setting for transformative supernatural events in medieval literature. It was here, for example, that great lakes and rivers burst forth, the primeval Druidic fire was lit, and the nobles of Ireland came together to reach agreement on the cosmological division of the island. So the cat stone on the hill's western slope is the most iconic symbol of the Axis Mundi at Uisneach, a massive glacial erratic with surrounding enclosure called the Navel of Ireland by Geraldus Cambrensis in the 12th century, and the Stone of Divisions, or Alnamiron, by Geoffrey Keating. As seems befitting, the hill does indeed lie at the proximate centre of Ireland, about midway between Athlone and Mullingar, County Westmeath, as we all know here. It is part of a belt of scattered uplands that extends southwest and northeast, and is surrounded by a dense network of rivers, streams and lakes, as well as many ancient monuments. The importance of the hill remains visible in the landscape today as a major assemblage of archaeological monuments and sites spanning many different periods, possibly stretching back more than 5,000 years. These include burial monuments, enclosures, standing stones, ring forts and an embanked roadway, as well as a possible ritual pond known as Loch Lugh and several springs and wells. Understanding of the site at the time of the early excavations, however, was primarily informed by medieval documentary sources, in addition to the earlier work of antiquarians such as John O'Donovan and George Petrie of the Ordnance Survey, who played a pivotal role in mapping the principal monuments and topographical features on the hill, as well as in naming monuments, including the Catstone. Their work was complemented by other scholars such as Borlas and Woods, who also recognized the archaeological importance of the site. MacAlister and Praeger's own interest in Uisneach was initially stimulated by Samuel Ferguson's influential treatise titled On Ancient Cemeteries at Rathcrowan and Elsewhere in Ireland, which was published in 1872. Ferguson was the first to provide a description and illustration of the earthworks at Rathnew, and suggested that the sites shared similarities with a large enclosure known as Relic Naree, or the Cemetery of the Kings, at Rathcrowan in County Roscommon, a place traditionally regarded as one of the major pagan cemeteries of ancient Ireland. As Ferguson described it, the area is not so great as that of Relic Naree, but the general arrangement and internal divisions of the Rathnew enclosure are so far of a cognate character as to produce a strong impression that they belong to the same period and have served the same purpose. A noteworthy parallel, as far as Ferguson was concerned, was that each of the earthworks enclosed a number of grass-covered mounds, which are shown on his illustration here. And these were thought to be tumuli, or burial mounds, with interments below the surface, which led him to propose that the Rathnew enclosure, like Relic Naree, was to be identified as an ancient cemetery. This was not the only theory to hold currency in the years that followed. Borlas, writing in 1897, for example, referred to the site as a ruined hill town, while several others have described it as a royal dune or palace. However, Ferguson's hypothesis was only seriously challenged when excavations at Relic Naree in 1913 demonstrated that this enclosure was, in fact, unlikely ever to have been a cemetery. As MacAlister, who took part in the excavation of Relic Naree, would later report, the outcome of that investigation provided the impetus for undertaking a concerted program of excavations at Uisneach. As he put it, the failure of the Rathcrowan excavation called our attention to the general subject of early Irish cemeteries and suggested to us that the Uisneach site might offer a crucial test of all theories as to their identification. MacAlister and Praeger began their archaeological work at Uisneach in the spring of 1925 and continued to work there intermittently until 1930. During this time, they investigated no fewer than 9 sites on the hill, all of which are upstanding visible monuments and earthworks that have been recorded on Ordnance Survey maps between 1838, it's the first edition maps, and 1914, the third edition. This was, by any standard, an ambitious undertaking and resulted in some remarkable discoveries. MacAlister and Praeger's report on the excavation of Uisneach, published in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy in 1928, focused mainly on the findings at Rathnew and also provided an account of most of the monuments known at the time. A subsequent 1931 report described the ancient structure at Totherstown on the northern side of the hill. MacAlister summarised the excavator's principal conclusions again in his 1935 work, Ancient Ireland. Important as their findings are, the investigations were not carried out or reported on to a modern standard, and this presents significant challenges for subsequent scholars. A comprehensive reappraisal of the excavation results is hindered by ambiguities often posed by early excavations, such as uncertainty about the location and extent of the excavation trenches, the absence of a detailed record of the site stratigraphy and the context of the finds, and the schematic nature of site plans and other drawings. As Ruth already alluded to, in the 1920s, archaeology was still transitioning from antiquarianism, and many advancements in recording and analysis were yet to come. Hugh O'Neill Henkin's excavations at nearby MacAlister only a few years later demonstrates the pace of methodological progress in this regard. Moreover, early archaeologists often took historical and literary sources at face value, using pseudo-historical chronicles and texts such as Laur Gabal Aaron, which MacAlister was one of the editors of, one of the editions, as frameworks for site chronology. Artifact typologies, rather than scientific dating methods, were the primary means of constructing chronologies, though radiocarbon dating would revolutionize the field in the 1950s. Judging by the cursory details published in relation to most of the sites investigated, it seems that in most cases the excavations were quite limited in scale, consisting of just 1 or 2 exploratory trenches. Among the sites targeted were 3 mounds or barrows, 3 enclosures, and the so-called ancient road leading from the base of the hill towards the eastern summit. Now the mounds, you can see, or possibly see, one at the top there near the Torristown Mound, another here on the eastern summit, and this site north of St. Patrick's Bed, and also several enclosures in addition to Torristown and the roadway here. So with a few exceptions, the findings from these investigations add little to our understanding of the sites targeted. However, the early excavations provided only a keyhole view of these monuments, and future work may yet show them to be more significant or complex than the excavation results might suggest. So in contrast to these sites investigated on a smaller scale, I just added the 2 larger enclosures. So in contrast to these earlier sites, 2 monuments at Uisneach were excavated almost in their entirety, and these are the large and impressive enclosure of Rathnew and on the northern slope of the hill, Torristown. The first site to be investigated by MacAlister and Praeger at Uisneach is the figure of H-shaped earthwork in Rathnew townland, known today simply as Rathnew Enclosure or the Palace, on account of its identification by historians and antiquarians as a royal fort. The enclosure is in a commanding position on the flank of the eastern summit of the hill, with extensive views to the south and east. The visible remains consist of 2 conjoined elements, a large, almost circular enclosure on the east, called the Eastern Enclosure, which you can see here, and a smaller semicircular enclosure attached to the western side. Together, these form a site type known as a conjoined ring fort, and both enclosures are bounded by 2 earth and stone ramparts with a ditch in between them. You can see the ramparts, or a section of the ramparts there on the top right. They were quite substantial. Now, recent LiDAR survey, which was commissioned by Meath County Council and undertaken in 2020, reveals the site in even greater detail, and this LiDAR data actually extends over an area of about 6 square kilometres, is that right? Yeah. So I just want to show that mostly just because you can see a view to some extent better of the some of the internal features, but I think it's easier to kind of visualize the layout of the enclosures on the excavation site plan. So the overall dimensions of this site are about 115 metres by 92 metres, making it the largest upstanding monument on the hill and one of the main focal points of the complex. MacAlister and Praeger investigated the site over a total period of 9 weeks between 1925 and 1928, during which time it appears that the whole of the enclosure, except some parts of the outer ditch, was excavated and then restored to its former condition. The investigations yielded some significant new insights, demonstrating not least that the Rathnew enclosure is not a cemetery as Samuel Ferguson had originally proposed, but instead a more complex multi-period site. MacAlister and Praeger identified 4 main phases of activity, originally dating them from the Bronze Age up to around the 3rd century AD. This timeline was clearly influenced by accounts of medieval and later historians, especially Geoffrey Keating, who linked the site with the ancient Bealtaine assemblies and legendary figures. So, as can be seen on the earlier LiDAR image on the post-excavation site plan, A number of structures and features were recorded in the interior of both enclosures, including several houses, this being the larger, more substantial of the two, known as the eastern house, and a second house on the eastern or on the western side, and what appears to be a later, possibly medieval, rectangular house as well. So we have the two houses, both of which, well, no, this one associated with a souterrain or underground passage or chamber beneath, and the other souterrain here in the central area of that enclosure. Other remains included evidence of burning, pits and post holes, and a substantial quantity of animal bones, including cattle and sheep, but also sheep, pig, horse, deer, and dog. Evidence of bronze and iron working was also found, as we could see in the form of these crucibles for copper working, and an important assemblage of artifacts was also unearthed, which, based on a detailed reassessment, dates the occupation of the ring fort to about late 7th to 11th centuries AD, considerably later than the chronology proposed by the excavators. Arguably, the most remarkable discovery, however, was a large ditched enclosure from an earlier period, found buried beneath the ramparts, or buried beneath the conjoined ring fort, rather. This enclosure is the earliest structure at the site and is represented by a series of ditches and pits within the central area of the eastern enclosure of the ring fort. So just point out, as was common at the time, all the features revealed by excavations were kind of superimposed on the same plan, whereas now we would deal with each of them separately. So it's kind of hard to disentangle them. But the main feature of this earlier enclosure is this ditch, measuring about 50 meters in diameter and with an eastern entrance. Some of the pits inside are aligned on that entrance and probably contemporary. And then there are a range of other features which may belong to the earlier phase or the later phase ring fort that superseded it. There are two ended inhumation burials just inside the entrance here, which are very difficult to see. Those seem to have been located just below the sod, so seem to be quite modern. They could, for example, be famine burials, which is quite common to use enclosures of this type for those kinds of burials, and as killings as well. So just taking out, say, these phase one features, the main features there, you get a better idea of what the site looked like. Excavation of the ditch revealed it to be up to about 1.2 meters deep and almost 3 meters wide, which is quite substantial. And it had a possible stone wall around it, at least on the south, but it may have surrounded it originally. Both the ditch and a series of pits and post holes inside the enclosure contained significant quantities of burnt and unburnt animal bone. And on the southwest side of the enclosure, which you just see the change there, marked a new feature in. On the southwest side of the enclosure, excavations revealed a large spread of ashes within the ditch, which is about midway up. The ditch had filled in halfway at this point. So this large spread of ashes contained very large quantities of intensely charred animal bones, many in a partially articulated condition. In other words, they weren't all broken apart and used for eating, feasting, but rather these animals or parts of them were consigned to the flames just for possibly ritual purpose, or almost certainly ritual purposes, and possibly sacrifice. According to the excavators, the evidence was strongly suggestive of a sanctuary site in which fire was kept burning perpetually or kindled at frequent intervals, and of animal sacrifices offered in this fire. This discovery aroused particular interest in light of Uisneach's traditional association with the Druidic fire cult and Bealtaine assembly, and fostered speculation that the position of the sacred fires, which made so deep an impression upon folk memory, had been identified. Alongside the two extended inhumation burials, which I pointed out just a moment ago, 3 fragments of unburnt bone from a child or adolescent were also found in the ditch and central area of this early enclosure. This was clearly an important sanctuary, and based on the kind of collective evidence, probably dates from between about the 3rd and 5th centuries AD, or somewhere in that time frame. And significantly, this sanctuary was deliberately incorporated within the circuit of the later so-called royal fort. Now, before considering the wider significance of the findings from Rathnew, it's worth noting that shortly after completing their excavations there, MacAlister and Praeger turned their attention to another large enclosure at Uisneach in Tahirstown townland, which I mentioned earlier. The enclosure is situated on a broad terrace on the northern flank of the hill, about 800 metres downslope of the summit. And it is one of several monuments clustered together on this part of the hill, and by far the most impressive. So you can see it just there at the top of the image. The other sites include a possible mound, which I pointed out earlier there, just marked by that black dot. The ring fort known as Rathfarson here, and a sub-rectangular enclosure. These sites were also investigated by MacAlister and Praeger, though on a more limited scale and with generally disappointing results. Although in the two enclosures, Rathfarson and the sub-rectangular enclosure, there were some signs of possible building remains identified. The Tahirstown enclosure is defined by two widely spaced concentric ramparts with external ditches and is about 80 metres in overall diameter. Let's go back here then. Yes, I should have pointed out there. That's the enclosure there, Tahirstown, in the centre. The sub-rectangular enclosure, the tree-covered mound, and the ring fort known as Rathfarson. So the Tahirstown enclosure is defined by two widely spaced concentric ramparts with external ditches and is about 80 metres in overall diameter. The enclosing ramparts were stone revetted and spaced about 12 to 18 metres apart. And these defined what the excavators termed the inner enclosure and the outer enclosure, respectively. There's a causewayed entrance on the east-northeast, which was paved with sandstone flags and revetted with stone facings. By virtue of its impressive size and apparent complexity, MacAlister and Praeger judged this enclosure to be almost equal in importance to the hilltop enclosure of Rathnew and regarded its examination as essential to a complete survey of the Uisneach complex, or the Uisneach remains rather. The monument was excavated over a period of 8 weeks between August 1929 and April 1930, and the results were published in the Proceedings of the Royal Irish Academy the following year. Overall, the excavation report is more succinct and coherent than that relating to Rathnew enclosure, and it also describes more fully the precise extent of their investigations, if not the exact location of all the excavation trenches. These investigations reveal the remains of a range of structures and features, most of them located within the inner enclosure, and there's a detailed plan of those there. These include a series of wall foundations and stone pavements, which were interpreted as forming open-air courts, as well as two elaborate souterrains, again, as we'd already seen in Rathnew, but on a much grander scale. You can see those coming through somewhere here, but I have another slide that shows a site plan of it and one of the chambers within this souterrain. There were also several hearths, pits, post holes, and other occupation debris. One of the most notable finds, or some of the more notable finds, included this highly accomplished gilt bronze disc brooch dating from around 800 BC, which shows three kind of interlinked figures, and a fragment of a stone slab decorated on both faces with prehistoric cup and ring ornament, which you can see at the bottom right there. And this is one of only a few examples of Bronze Age rock art recorded in the area, and hints at early prehistoric activity on the hill. It may have come, for example, from a standing stone that was decorated or a burial monument. Although few details of the site stratigraphy were recorded, it is nonetheless possible to distinguish two broad phases of activity. The first of these is marked by the construction and main period of use of the enclosure, and the second by the remains of a rectangular building built on top of the dilapidated outer rampart, which had fallen into disrepair. This suggests that the primary occupation of the enclosure was followed by a period of more open settlement after the ramparts had subsided and the ditches had largely filled in, and this was possibly in the later medieval period. The radial walls dividing the outer enclosure were also considered to be later than the main occupation. There was insufficient evidence, however, to determine whether there was a lapse in activity between these two phases, and many of the structures and deposits uncovered at the Towerstown site cannot be assigned to a particular phase. Like the Rathnew enclosure, however, its exceptional size and the quality of the few personal items found within the ring fort, such as the disc brooch, testifies to the high social standing of the occupants, a status which in early medieval Irish society would have been dependent on the ownership of large numbers of cattle. The lack of any obvious houses and the near complete absence of occupation debris in the outer enclosure suggests that this was no ordinary settlement, and it may have had a more specialised function within the wider royal domain of Uisneach, perhaps as a compound for livestock. So despite the challenges posed by the early excavations, the discoveries made by the excavators remain highly significant, providing clear evidence of the high status of the Rathnew and Towerstown enclosures and important insights into their chronology and development. Both sites witnessed sustained activity over many centuries. The successive late Iron Age and early medieval enclosures at Rathnew may have spanned a period of almost 1,000 years. The types of artefacts and features such as souterrains unearthed at Towerstown suggest that this bivalent ring fort is of broadly the same period as the Rathnew site. A reassessment of the findings from both sites points to occupation between about the late 7th and the 11th centuries, with some indications, as I mentioned, of later features extending into to the medieval period. Unlike other ring forts at Uisneach, the Rathnew enclosure was built in the midst of the prehistoric complex on the summit, at a time when the Clan Colman kings of Uisneach were very much at the height of their power. Not only does this ostensibly royal ring fort incorporate the remains of the earlier sanctuary enclosure, but there are also several other highly significant sites nearby. Only a short distance to the north and clearly visible from the Rathnew enclosure is a prominent mound crowning the eastern summit of the hill. MacAlister and Praeger, who investigated the mound, reported that a kist or stone-laying grave, possibly of a type similar to this one here, which is from Ruisneadh, not too far away. So it reported that a kist like this had been found within the mound prior to the 1920s, so prior to their own excavations, which suggests that it may be a bowl barrow of early Bronze Age date, if that is indeed the site of a kist burial. This mound is very likely to be the monument known as Carn Ludach, where, according to medieval tradition, the god Lu was buried after he was drowned in the summit lake of Loch Lu, or Loch Laborta, during an assembly. Although the mound is the only visible monument on this part of the hill today, recent geophysical investigations have revealed a wealth of buried features and other traces of activity around it, including some major discoveries, which significantly augment the findings of the early excavations. By far the most significant finding is a subcircular enclosure that surrounds the entire eastern summit of the hill, which you can see at the top right. At about 200 metres in diameter, the enclosure is truly monumental in scale. It straddles the boundaries of 3 adjoining townlands, and although parts of its circuit are obscured by townland boundary walls, the geophysical evidence indicates that it is defined by a substantial ditch, which was probably cut into the underlying limestone shale bedrock. The enclosure entrance is on the east-northeast. I don't know if you can see, I think it's stretched, so, oh no, it's still there. You can see it just there, it's a bit faint. And that is defined by 2 quite distinctive inward curving terminals. This entrance aligns on a prominent mound on the summit, presumably Carn Ludach, which you see there, and worth noting potentially the black, some of the black marks in the interior of that mound could be backfilled excavation trenches from MacAlister or the earlier people who investigated it. So the mound we have at the centre, occupying a central position within the enclosure, and there are also quite a few additional features such as ring ditches, which may be a type of burial monument found inside the enclosure. I mentioned there that the enclosure is overlooking the site of Loch Lou. And in fact, part of the ditch of the enclosure on this side, as you can see here, is still visible. So that's interesting as well as regards to the potential for reuse of this site, which may be ancient, into a later period. In other words, it was still known to exist. So this is a ceremonial monument, clearly from its size, the presence of the mound at its centre, and its location within a broader complex of funerary and ritual monuments. This gives a better idea of kind of the layout of these features in relation to one another, including the ring fort of Rathnew. The scale of the enclosures, as well as aspects of its design, more text coming on, invite close comparison with sites such as Tara, Navan Fort and Rathcrohan, where large Iron Age enclosures with internal mounds are a distinctive feature. Ancient mounds such as these appear to have played an important role in legitimising the rule and the territorial claims of medieval dynasts. The prominence of the mound identified as Cairn Ludach, or Lou's Grave Mound, and its surrounding 200-metre diameter enclosure raises a distinct possibility that both monuments may have served as foci for royal ceremonies and assemblies at Uisneach. Of course, we have the place name evidence from the sites themselves of Loch Lou and Loch Luborta, and the evidence of the archaeology with these large enclosures. But also, quite insightful is the fact that the village of Loch na Valley, just on the east side of the hill here, was until recent centuries the location of an annual fair held on the 15th of August. So it could very well be that the site, the hilltop, was associated or was the site of a Lunasa assembly that had that were the origins of the Loch na Valley festival many centuries later. So there's a lot of evidence to support now, a growing body of evidence to support the identification of Uisneach with a Lunasa assembly, possibly in addition to one at Bealtaine. One such kind of possible scenario, how an assembly might have played out, has been very evocatively reimagined by the artist J.G. O'Donoghue, which shows of many of the features that we've just been looking at. The Rathnew enclosure here with its houses, the mound of Cairn Ludach, the enclosure itself, and Loch Lou here. So these would have been really quite boisterous, I suppose, events, parties basically, with a lot of things going on, an opportunity for people to come together and meet and form alliances and marriages and all these sorts of things. So the potential significance of Loch Lou itself as a focus for prehistoric ritual activity is also underscored by extensive evidence for votive deposition, basically sacrifices, in wet locations in the surrounding landscape, as well as at sacred lakes and pools such as the King's Stables at Navan. We recently undertook a lake history study of Loch Lou involving the extraction of sediment cores from the lake bed. And this was a project undertaken with colleagues at the University of Galway and the Discovery Programme. And although the results aren't confirming it yet, the evidence is suggesting that the lake may have been dug out in the past to create an open water pool. So that's an interesting phenomenon as well. Now, other high-profile sites and areas of the hill have also been targeted for geophysical investigation at Uisneach, including the dilapidated cairn on the highest point of the hill, known as St. Patrick's Bed, which is probably the remains of a Neolithic tomb. So 2 circular palisade trenches measuring 23 metres and 35 metres in diameter were revealed by geophysical survey and show that a sequence of open-air timber structures possibly temples, stood on this spot before the tomb was erected. And the smaller 23-meter enclosure you can see here actually partly underlies the tomb, so we know it's an earlier feature. And you can see the outline here of the larger 35. The image is a bit distorted on the slide, but this larger has an entrance on the east and potentially here as well. So just to give a kind of idea of what these types of palisaded enclosures may have looked like in the Neolithic period. This is an example from Gothic, in Germany. And a lot of these types of structures also have special alignments on rising or setting sun and solstice and all these things as well. So these circular temples clearly stood on the spot before the tomb was erected. And megalithic tombs are rare in Westmeath, with very few in Ireland giving evidence of earlier wooden structures. The passage tombs at Tara and Knowth in Meath are notable examples. So it's very likely that this particular tomb and the palisaded enclosures that preceded it are among the earliest ritual and funerary monuments in the region. Several other barrows and ring ditches, as you can see here, a varying form. Let's see. Wasn't the one to meant, but anyway, that's okay. That's a ring barrow there and the site plan there. So several other barrows and ring ditches surround St. Patrick's Bed, including this well-preserved ring barrow on the spur just north of the tomb. And this is one of the sites, again, that MacAlister and Praeger excavated a section across. And they identified a stone setting at its center, but found no associated burials or artifacts. So that's just kind of to give a highlight some of the main discoveries that have been made in the years since MacAlister and Praeger's excavations. And I suppose, yeah, what we can say from this, in addition to the major contribution of MacAlister and Praeger to our understanding of the site, we also have ongoing work, which is constantly expanding our, what we know about the site, and even just in terms of the number of known monuments, which has more than doubled in the last 20 years or so. This might expand further yet because the LiDAR survey has also revealed potential features that still have to be investigated more fully. But so I suppose overall what we can say is that, from the period, this kind of position of relative obscurity that it had after MacAlister's and Praeger's excavations had finished until new work started 70 years later, that has changed altogether. At this point, and now, I'm still on Burrows there. Now, of course, Uisneach is grouped with the five other royal sites on the UNESCO World Heritage List: Tara in County Meath, Rathcrowan, Dún Áine, the Rock of Cashel, and Navanfort in Armagh. In addition, the site boasts a full calendar of events and tours, including the famous Fire Festival of Bealtaine. And there's a really strong spirit of community involvement and dedication, commitment to heritage protection and conservation of the hill, including on the part of David and Angela Clark, the landowners, and everyone involved with Uisneach. So they're all to be congratulated on, bringing the site, to public attention more and taking care of it. They're custodians of the hill. So thanks very much. Thank you.